Hi everyone, it's Professor Todd, and this is the third video of the Bluest Eye series, and in this video we will be discussing the spring section. So in our previous videos and sections, we discussed some of the themes that Morrison was exploring about powerlessness and the impacts of oppression and the impacts of not having agency, particularly as they relate to the young Black poor girls in the novel. And so in this first chapter of Spring, we see kind of the impact of that when Claudia is sexually assaulted by Henry. Frida, not Claudia. When Frida is sexually assaulted by Henry, and how both Frida and Claudia don't entirely understand what it is that happened to them. And so because they don't understand their own sexuality or sexuality in general, this is another way in which they're left sort of powerless and looking to the adults around them to contextualize this. And I think that the reason that Morrison starts with this incident with Frida is because it does give us a contrast later to the sexual assault and the rape, really, of Piccola. Right. So with Frida, when the assault happens with Henry, Frida's parents respond the way that we would expect parents to, right? They're outraged. They attack Henry. They drive him out of town. They protect their daughter. Contrast this with what happens to Piccola, where it is actually her own father who assaults her. So there is that distinction between what we see with Frida and what we see with Piccola, and what that tells us about both their circumstances in life and the impact that the sexual assaults have on them. Frida seems to be less traumatized than Piccola. And by and large, both of them don't entirely understand what happens to them, right? Or the context in which it happens to them. We see this lack of understanding about their sexuality earlier in the novel with like the discussion of menstruation and the way that they interact with the prostitutes in the novel, not really understanding them as sex workers and thinking that the reason people find Maginot Line distasteful is because of her weight, not because of her occupation. So all of this shows really a naivety and a lack of understanding about their own sexuality, which is another way in which they are left sort of powerless in the novel. The next two the next two chapters of the spring section give us background on both Polly and Cholly Breedlove. And I think it's important here that we kind of ask ourselves why Morrison gives us that background. So with Polly, we see the way in which she started her courtship with Cholly with sort of this idealized, romanticized life in mind. And then when that wasn't a reality, Polly creates a different reality for herself, right? So she goes to the house of the white people who employ her, and she lives a different life there. And when those lives intersect, when we see the girls come to Polly's place of employment where the white family lives, we see Polly treating her own daughter with sort of disgust and distaste. When Piccola spills the blackberries everywhere and the mess occurs and and Piccola is burned by them and we see her crying. Polly's instinct is to protect and to comfort the white child and not her own daughter. And so what that really shows is not only how pervasive this belief is, that so much so that Polly has internalized it to a point that her own maternal instincts are stifled by it, right? She's comforting the white child instead of her own daughter, and she's cursing her own daughter and getting angry at her for creating the mess. And again, notice the symbolism of the blackberries, the mess being associated with blackness, right? And the way in which all of that is distasteful, and the color contrast in that scene is particularly important. The white child is associated with like pink and yellow and whiteness, right? All colors that have positive connotations. So then we move into a chapter with Cholly, and we get his background, the way in which he's rejected by first his mother and then his father, and the impact that has on him, his detachment and his really cruelty after that point. And so we see Cholly, who becomes reckless and dangerous because of a complete rejection and because of a total internalized self-loathing, right? This belief that he is not good enough, that he's not lovable, that he's not, that he is all of the things that society has told him that he is. He starts to believe that. And what that results in is the rape of his daughter, right? And I think that it's important to consider here when you're looking at that chapter why Morrison chooses to present this rape from the perspective of Cholly. It's not from the perspective of Pecola. It is from the perspective of the abuser and not the victim. And I think that this is very intentional on the part of Morrison, and it's just after giving us the entire backstory of Cholly. And I don't believe that the intention is to somehow imply that Cholly is not responsible for the actions or that the actions aren't horrendous. But I think it's to help the reader understand why this happened, right? And so to us, it seems like an act that is completely, that's not understandable to us. And yet Morrison puts it in a context where we can see how it happened. It's not that we're excusing that it happened, but we understand how it happened. And the how is as important as the why. And when we think about how, the message that Morrison is giving us is that Cholly is a product of the environment that created him, right? So it's not that Cholly is not responsible for his actions, but we are all responsible for Cholly's actions because we have created a society that created Cholly, right? When we devalue someone so completely, and when we oppress someone, when systematic oppression is so pervasive, and when someone feels that they have no other options and they're left completely powerless and vulnerable, and they are time and time again rejected and told how awful they are, then of course they internalize that, and this is the natural result. And so I think that that's kind of part of what Morrison's larger message is. It's not just about individual responsibility, but it's about societal responsibility and the way in which we all contribute to this. And it's a way of making the reader reflect on their own participation in a society that is where racism and oppression and sexism are also pervasive. Okay, so in the next section or the next video, we will discuss the final section, which is the summer section, and we see sort of the fallout and outcome of all of this for Pecola, our protagonist.